There's one big idea at the heart of Andrew Wilson's remarkable book, Remaking the World: How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West, published by Crossway. He argues that more than any other year in the last millennium, the last 1,000 years, 1776 made us who we are today in the West. I suppose many listeners, especially in the United States, are thinking, of course, the Declaration of Independence. Ron Swanson said it best. History began on July 4th, 1776. But wait, didn't Andrew just say the post-Christian West? What does he mean about that? Well, Andrew demonstrates a lot of courage writing about 1776 as the teaching pastor of King's Church, London. But one of the most important points of his book is that the American Revolution was just one of many world-changing events and ideas crossing and recrossing the Atlantic in and around 1776. In fact, he argues the battles were less important than the words. Human rights, free trade, liberal democracy, religious pluralism, the preference for authenticity over authority, choice over duty, self-expression over self-denial. Andrew traces it all back to 1776. Now, Ron Swanson might not be right that history began on July 4th, 1776, but Andrew does argue that 1776 separates us from the past. He writes this: "The vast majority of people in human history have not shared our views of work, family, government, religion, sex, identity, or morality, no matter how universal or self-evident we may think they are." In Andrew's telling, the West is full of Protestant pagans, and Christians are victims of our own success. So I can't wait to ask him about his favorite stories and his fervent hopes. Andrew, thanks for joining me on Gospel Bound.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic introduction. It's a great joy to talk.
Maybe
you
I'll
were probably
embed...
one of the first people who ever got excited about this project, so I feel like I owe you a huge debt of gratitude that it got published at all, so thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, again, I've been looking forward to this for a long time and diving deep on this. I've read the book twice and thought about it nonstop in many ways since even my second reading of it. Appropriately, you will of course appreciate that it came while I was staying in Cambridge. Only seemed fitting. But Andrew, how do you even begin to conceive of a book with this kind of scope? I mean, when did you start to connect the dots about 1776?
So I was on holiday in France about 6 years ago when I was reading a book by Ian Morris called Why the West Rules for Now. It was really a sort of book about why the West has been ahead of the East for a long time and why that's now changing. And it was a really interesting thing. And in the course of it, he was talking about the fact that the steam engine was in Watt's steam engine and the wealth of nations happened within the same weekend in 1776. And I thought, hang on, that's probably the key invention in industrial history and the most important economics book ever written happened in the same year as the Declaration of Independence. That's really, I've never been told that, I didn't know that. And then as these things go, you start digging and you think, oh my goodness, this is a really important year in the history of Romanticism and in navigation and sort of interconnecting of different parts of the world and the Enlightenment. And I knew enough about the period because I studied a bit of it when I was an undergrad in history to sort of see the way that the build up to the French Revolution, the Enlightenment and so on. And I thought, wow, this is a really significant year. That's an interesting story. I wonder if I'll ever talk about it. But that on its own doesn't become a book, at least it'd be quite a weird one. I think what joined dots for me was then when I was also at the same kind of time getting into Jonathan Haidt's work and his idea of the West being weird or Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. And I know you've talked to Haidt before and I found him very helpful and interesting. And I think that somewhere a collision between these two concepts came together. And I thought, actually, the things that made the transformations which made us Western or rich or romantic or industrialized, those things, there's an example of a change that happened in this year that made all of those things happen. And I think if I brought the two of them together, I could tell a really interesting story about why we are like we are and what the church can do about it.
So give me, based on that foundation, give me your biggest surprise when you're researching where you're thinking, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was also 1776.
Right. So I think the biggest surprise, maybe this not very quite wise. The biggest surprise I got was the thing that I think you and I have talked about before, which is the fact that the edit to the Declaration of Independence, which I didn't know, and I was the idea that Ben Franklin said, no, you shouldn't say these truths are sacred and undeniable. You should say they're self-evident, and we might come back to that. But that to me was the big it's like a mic drop. Wow, that's such a significant development, because that's not just a political issue now. That's a very important, I think, parable of the post-Christian West. I think the events that I hadn't placed in that year, I think there was a couple of really trivial ones that just blew me away. Like I found, I put it in a footnote, but it isn't important enough to tell a story at any length. But I found that in the same year, the Illuminati and I think it's the Phi Beta Kappa, so the first secret society in America and the major secret society in Europe, were also both founded in the same year, unrelated to each other, in 1776. And I just thought, why is things even at that random a level also happening in this year? What's going on in the West that's causing those two really apparently quite unrelated things to happen? There's a great many others, but I think once you start with the big industrial, economic, and religious and political developments, like an awful lot of other things almost flow out of that. But it was almost like this, very odd details that I found really fascinating were also taking place in the same year. They're not very important, but that's partly why I found them so fascinating.
You already alluded to this, Andrew, that maybe I'm not the best interviewer on this book because I share so much of your fascination with history. I mean, I majored in European history, no less. I'm wondering, why should other Christians, maybe not the folks that spend a lot of time reading the kinds of things that you and I do for fun, why should they care about your book? Is it just because it tells engaging stories of the past, which it definitely does, but why should others care?
Well, I think that early feedback I've had from people who wouldn't normally read big history books, which has been encouraging and is what I hoped, is that people have said this just helps me connect and explain things that are going on in our current world, and it helps me see them in a way that makes sense of things that appear not to be connected to each other, that gives me a story that goes, oh, okay, that's why that and that are both part of the same wider phenomenon. And it's back to the classic thing, if it means I'm reading the newspaper or I'm online and I'm scrolling, seeing something that's just happened, and it's enabling me to join dots and make connections and connect them to the influence and role of Christianity in the world and the way the church can respond to it. So towards the end of the book, I try and equip people, this is how we can respond. But even in telling the story itself, I think you can give Christians some agency or power sounds a bit dramatic, but you can to some degree, because you say, look, this is a name for that thing you've experienced, and this is not just a weird development that sprung out of nowhere. And I was particularly writing that in light of what I think of as another very intense period of cultural change between about 2014 and 2017 in the West, where a huge amount of dominoes seem to fall culturally at once. And a lot of Christians, probably even more in your country than mine, I expect, just kind of thrown and like, what on earth? These changes are all coming out of nowhere. And I think by putting them in the context of a bigger story, you can give people a sense of, I can name it, I can see the journey, I can understand why that does kind of follow from where we were. It's not as shocking, it's not as disorienting, and hopefully give people a sense of a coherent narrative to understand why it is, and also how we might respond to it without panicking or freaking out or whatever it is.
I thought this quote from your book was helpful on this point. You said, "The rate of change in the last 2 centuries makes the past feel much further away than it actually is, which inclines us to fawn over the future and either patronize the past or ignore it altogether." I think that's just an important concept about the significance of history and the way that we're especially ill-equipped in this place and time to be able to understand it, but which I think your book does a great job of helping us to see its significance. Of all the different wide-ranging aspects of the book, which of these threads, which of them is the most fun, your favorite to be able to pull on?
That's a good question, and I haven't been asked that before. I think, well, I'll answer that two ways. I think the one that I most enjoyed learning about is the sort of the economic and material changes in the world, because that's probably the one where I had the least idea at the start of the story where it was going to go. I don't think I'd ever seen before that if you draw a graph of the economic growth of the human race, GDP per person or whatever it is, that it looks like a hockey stick. It just goes flat for 10,000 years and then shoots up, and the inflection point is somewhere around the mid 1770s. And that was just such an extraordinary thing to see, and such an important development. That was probably the most fun to understand, or to see for the first time. But I think the one I probably most enjoyed writing about in many ways was the one on Romanticism, because again, I just find these characters, some of them that are at work, and I talk a bit about the sort of German playwrights gathering around Goethe, and I talk about Giacomo Casanova, who'll be a name that's known to a lot of people, but most people don't know very much about him. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is just an extraordinarily odd, brilliant genius, but it's very strange man. And I just found the characters, it's almost, probably the chapter where the storytelling is the easiest and the most fun, because they're just such extraordinary people. And at one point I'm reading away, and then I'm discovering, hang on a second, the plot of the Shawshank Redemption is based on the escape from jail of this 18th century philanderer who breaks out of jail by hiding a spike inside a Bible, hides behind a painting, goes out through a hole in the wall. You're like, how did this happen? And I've never known it before. So there was so much fun in that chapter just to discover this stuff. And I hope, as you say, that some of the book is just trying to tell a really interesting story, but obviously with apologetic undertones and a hope of application, which I hope emerges as well.
Just trying to imagine Rousseau and Franklin hanging out.
yeah. I just imagine Rousseau and anybody hanging out. Ben Franklin, I think, is one of the most ordinary 21st century, but he looks like if he parachuted into your town now, he'd probably be okay. He just doesn't seem like he belongs to another era in quite the way that many characters do. And Rousseau is the opposite. He's just a total weirdo, but a brilliant man who's shaped us all in all kinds of ways.
Now, my next question is a pretty big one, but it's one of my hobby horses, and it's my show, so I get to talk about it. Explain why you don't buy into the Enlightenment narrative, the triumph of freedom and reason over the dogmas of the Dark Ages. I really appreciate your comment that you don't hear as much about this story when you're touring Cambridge University or Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris.
Yeah. And by the way, great shout on Notre Dame. That's I was actually waiting for the end of that sentence, wondering if he was going to Notre Dame it on a podcast. European history major protected him.
We're talking about Paris, not about football. So That's why.
No, and that is a good example. So I have that because I live very near I drive past it regularly, a 1,000-year-old castle near my house, which is sort of where the Normans landed. And when people see it, they're like, it's like the Dark Ages. It's all sort of everyone's just eating turnips and dying of plague. But then you consider what medieval society in Europe developed, invented, understood. You look at, particularly in that, I mean, I think you got to concede some of the force of it. You've got to say that after the Roman Empire collapsed, that the political instability and the military chaos that was unleashed on Europe between the years, say, 500 and around 900, were obviously destructive for economic growth and literacy and many other things. But I think as soon as you see the turn, certainly around the turn of the millennium, from about year 1000 onwards, you see enormous creativity, industry growth, the rise of trade, the rise of guilds, and the building of cathedrals, and the establishing of civil society, and the burgher towns, and universities, and clocks. And you just think, and astronomy, and you think actually that even just the university is a medieval European invention. And you just realize this is silliness. What's happened is people have told a story with ourselves at the end of it, in such a way as to amplify the difference between how brilliant we are and how dim they were.
Right.
And in doing so have completely distorted the evidence. And I think it is, in a way, it's a propaganda tool. And it was originally, there's the fun thing, again, to dig into this, of course, is it's a Protestant propaganda tool.
That was going to be my next. It was going to be my next question right there. Are Protestants to blame for this?
Yeah, basically, at least originally. So the first guy to use the language of the Middle Ages or the Middle Age was writing in the same year as the Gunpowder Plot, which is a very big part of British life. 1605, Catholics tried to blow up the government, and we still memorialise the fact that it didn't blow up by fireworks and bonfires and all that jazz in Britain. And that's where the term Middle Age comes from. It's a Protestant narrative saying, well, there was this obviously this early church, and then there's this dark Middle Age, and then there's Protestantism. And all that happens with the transition over the next 150 years, Europeans begin to say, well, that's not quite the story, but it's very similar. There's the world of antiquity, of brilliant Greek, Roman thinkers and beautiful poetry and lovely buildings and togas and grapes. And then it all goes quiet and weird and dark, and everyone eats turnips and dies of plague and burns witches. And then European enlighteners emerge in around Isaac Newton's often, get credited with a lot of that. And then in the sort of 17th and 18th century, Europeans switch the lights on and everyone gets knowledge. And so it's really a Protestant story with some of the details changed, and the heroes now become Edward Gibbon or Voltaire rather than Luther and Calvin, but the story's basically the same shape. So yeah, I think Protestants are in large part to blame. And of course there are some details of that story that you can rescue and say, well, there's a degree of truth in it, as I touched on, but it's a very, very distorted flattening of what really happened in Europe, let alone elsewhere, which of course is one of the worst things about that story, is it just totally censors not even Europe as a whole, just a particular part of northwestern Europe, and says this is where it's at, and we're the guys responsible for enlightening the world, to which obviously many people who were enslaved or deported or colonized would say, seriously? So it's not a good version of history.
Yeah, I wonder if American listeners might not be as familiar with how that narrative has been undermined, even in recent years. I was with our friend James Eglinton up in Edinburgh this summer, and we were walking around, and sure enough, there's the statue of David Hume, but look at all the problems because of David Hume's views on race. All of a sudden, he's getting canceled because he doesn't fit anymore. We've become enlightened on that topic. So let's talk about that, how you see racism affecting that reception of the Enlightenment story today. And I just need to read this for this day as you're gathering your thoughts. I just need to, say this. This is a great line about the philosophers. The Western world has been illuminated by their powerful blend of sense and sensibility and their laudable commitment to persuasion, but we have also been darkened by their pride and prejudice. You must have had fun writing that one.
I really did, and I'm so glad you've noticed it, because I'm honestly worried that lots of people will just be going, what's he on about here? It's just so flowery, and then it's... But obviously,
hat tip Jane Austen right there.
Austen fans, yeah. And of course, I do think that I do think that she's, at least in Sense and Sensibility, there is something deliberate there. I'm not an Austen scholar, but I think the idea that those are that is very much of the period. Pride and Prejudice, obviously, she's not talking about Enlightenment views of race, but I am. Yeah, I think it is obviously. We hugely overuse the word problematic as a modern society, but it is really, really bad when you read, particularly when you consider these are not minority, the racial stereotypes and outright bile, really, that comes forth from some of these key writers are not coming from minor figures. I think in a way, if you dig hard enough, you can badmouth almost any movement, because every movement's going to have someone somewhere who says something bad. But this isn't that. This is David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Voltaire, who the giants of the French, Scottish, and German Enlightenments, and they just said terrible, appalling things. I can't quote them from memory, but I wouldn't want to if I could. I mean, some of the things that are being said, now that's not to say every enlightener believed all of those things. And it's not to say, I think you could have a very reasonable discussion about what is the right way to respond to statues of people who discovered very important things and said some great stuff and then said some absolutely terrible stuff. Like, I think you could have that debate, and obviously many of us did in the 2020. But that aside, there's what is being said and affirmed based on a very Eurocentric narrative of history, mixed sometimes interestingly with a real hatred of biblical anthropology. That's sometimes what's motivating it. Is certainly in Voltaire that the anti-Semitism, a lot of the racism, is actually partly coming from a place where they're trying to distance themselves as much as possible from the idea that God created all humanity in Adam and Eve and his descent. So this idea of common descent is a huge problem And then there's a Eurocentric narrative, and there's just good old-fashioned bigotry in there as well.
Yeah.
And the combination of those things produces these just vile racial, not just epithets and the sort of sneering laziness that you often get in a sort of garden variety racism, but actually sometimes people quite explicitly, Hume does, he just explicitly goes, okay, I have heard rumours of this, black guy who's meant to be quite clever, but actually he's just parroted all of that from somewhere. He's just a parrot. He's heard it all somewhere else. You think, enough educated black men in your, and they are mostly men in your day, to surely understand that what you're saying is not a fair representation. So that is one of the big, dark spots on the record of the Enlighteners. And it's not something from which Christians are immune either, of course, as we know. But it's I just think it's important to say, not to trash the entire Enlightenment, but to say this is not quite the darkness to light story you've been told.
Let's jump to your chapter on skeptics. You observe this, a little bit of a longer quote here. Contingent religious beliefs now sound like self-evident secular truths. The year of our Lord has been universalized. The rights of humanity have been standardized. The redistribution of wealth has been normalized. And all you need is love. Christianity, in that sense, became a victim of its own success. It baked its moral norms so deeply into Western culture that people eventually forgot where they came from. End quote. So, Andrew, do you think we're close to losing not just the memory, but also the norms themselves?
Well, this is one of the interesting questions, and the answer is I don't know. I feel like we're probably a lot further away from it than some of the more apocalyptic accounts would suggest we are. And I think that's because moral norms of the kind that we're talking about, the human dignity, are baked very deeply into the what I would call the post-Christian West, or post-Christendom. And I think in a strange way that has been ratified and made harder to eradicate by the attempts in the 20th century to get rid of them, to redefine the moral norms. You think particularly of the Nazis, and I don't want to be the guy who drops in the Nazis for the sake of it, but obviously that was a particularly virulent attempt to anti-Christianize values, really, to say, we're not going to treat people as if they're all created equal, and we're going to explicitly oppose that version of morality and try and valorize strength. And that, of course, has got its connections to Nietzschean thinking and even social Darwinism, although I don't blame either Darwin or Nietzsche for all the things the Nazis did, of course. And I think that attempt was so vile in its outcomes that I think it's almost reinforced people's desire to never let that happen again, even if they don't have really a metaphysical ground for not doing it. And so I think what's happened is the tastes of Western people have made it feel revolting to say not all human beings are created equal, even though people say, I don't even really believe in creation, let alone in created equality. Right. So you end up in a strange position where people are saying, I definitely don't want to go there with the moral conclusion of rejecting Christianity on the human dignity. But at the same time, I definitely don't want to go with the Christians on why we believe it. So I kind of going to preserve the fruit and hope no one will notice that I no longer hold to the roots, and trust that will stay for as long as it can. I think the overall, it doesn't make logical sense as such to me, but I think it will probably last a good while longer, in part because of primarily the Nazi attempt, and also in other areas, communism and others, to eradicate it. I think people will still for a very long time have a memory of what happens when you don't hold to that kind of view of human beings.
Now, later in the book, you describe this cognitive dissonance. You've alluded to it just there, the moral fruit without the spiritual root, and say that the, quote, post-truth world is an unaffordable luxury, end quote, to the oppressed and disfranchised. You clearly alluded to it there with the communists and the Nazis and the people who suffered their tyrannies. What else do you have in mind here?
I think there's all sorts of things about the way people conceive of, and by the way, some of them are more at risk in our generation than others, I think. But I think if you go back to your Declaration of Independence, okay, so just take a line, which is obviously very, very formative expression of Christian anthropology for modern politics and economics, as well as morality and the duties you owe your fellow humans. You can just say, it's self-evident to us, or whatever, sacred and undeniable to us, that all people are created equally and endowed with certain inalienable rights. Now, those that statement contains a huge amount of Christian anthropology. It's obviously got a creator. It's got people who are made effectively equal to one another. Doesn't quite say in the image of God, but that's the gist of it. And that undergirds the UN Declaration on Human Rights and everything we believe about what humans owe one another, obligations and duties to our fellow humans. And so I think there have been some, as I say, experiments to say we are not going to go there and we're going to go harder the other direction, as we've talked about. But I think there are other things that do just get chipped away when you take away those foundations. I think we could talk about more, contemporary issues like abortion would be an example of an issue where it's a sort of there's a foot in the door, and even what some people have been able to say and still remain in the public square with some degree of respectability. Think of somebody like Peter Singer on infanticide, where you think, well, the fact that that's able to be said,
sure.
You certainly at the other end of life, you have the way that various nations, that you think of the Dutch or the Canadians, on the way and people talk about euthanasia, assisted dying, whatever people want to call it, and you realize actually the combination of euphemism, a lack of clarity in the public square about what exactly is going on, and an erosion of Christian anthropology can lead to some pretty unpleasant causes even now. So I'm not saying we go from there straight to Nazism or anything. I mean, I'm not doing that at all, I think. But what happens is that you do destabilize Christian anthropology, and over time, people will no longer take it for granted that the fact that someone is human, therefore they're made in the image of God, means you can't kill them no matter who they are. You might find rationales that might say, well, if people are very small or very old or whatever. Now, that's one example. Yeah. I think there's plenty of others as well. But to me, that feels like quite a pressing one in our day, and one that most people listening to this are probably aware of and to some degree troubled by. But I think it's part of that larger story of what's happened to those norms in the West.
Yeah, what do you make of it, Andrew, the difference between some of the most utilitarian approaches to death of the weak? So you go back to the Nazi era, and the thought is they're parasites on society. We don't have the resources to take care of them. Today it's more like, well, why would you want to stay alive if you don't feel fulfilled and happy? Because that's the point of life. Is there a common thread between those two, or are they entirely different, just with the same result that the weak are the ones who suffer and ultimately die?
Yeah, I think they can be closely aligned, in as much as they both ways of thinking regard human beings who are not perceived by others as contributing, particularly to public life and economic flourishing, as having less value. And in the end, when a subsection of the population get dehumanized and then taken out in history, it's often because they're regarded as being economically unproductive. That was what was behind the witch crazes in large part. It's what's behind, obviously, infanticide in many parts of the world. You just don't do that to people who are economically productive and able to fend for themselves. And similarly, for people who are either very old or very sick. And so I think there are commonalities, but I also think that the rationale is fundamentally different, in the sense that it's interesting, people arguing for euthanasia or abortion are often using quite Christian-sounding arguments for it, even though the arguments against it are also Christian. They're using language of compassion, or the desire to protect the rights of the mother, or to make sure that people don't suffer too much, which is, of course, not the way that the Nazis were justifying what they did. So I think that the rationale has been very influenced by Christianity. I don't think, therefore, it's a Christian thing to do, as I've said, but I think that you have this fascinating example where, and this is a sort of Tom Hollandism, but where the culture wars are often a civil war within Christianity, only one side of which realizes they're thinking in a Christian way. And I think there is quite a lot to be said for that on a number of these, particularly life issues that we've just talked about.
You argue that Christendom was hoisted by its own petard, and we look at increased wealth, power, sexual permissiveness, independence, individualism. They've all contributed to decreased church attendance, decreased size of families, diminished religion overall. So let's jump into another big question. I mean, what's the response? I doubt you'd say we should go back to Christendom, even if we could. That's a big movement today, or a growing movement among some Christians today. I certainly struggled to see how we could reverse the effects of industrialization. Even if we wanted the old communities and the family structures, we wouldn't put up with the medicine, or the lack of transportation, or the lack of mobility, things like that. So what's the response?
Well, of course, in part, I'd say too soon to say. We're feeling our way, aren't we? In part, I'd say that's what I'm trying to do in chapters 10 and 11
Right.
of the book, and that's what many of us are trying to do, isn't it? I mean, you and I involved a lot in trying to help the church think through the way to respond to basically a new moment in the history of the church. I think it helps me to think this is not the first time. It's the first time this has happened, but it's not the first time that significant
Right.
economic and industrial and technological change has caused the church to completely rethink how it does evangelism, discipleship, churchmanship, and so on. That's obviously you'd think about that in the late 15th and early 16th centuries would be a very obvious example of how that happened around the time of the Reformation and just before it. But I think you had to do the same you'd probably say the 4th century would be another one of those times, and some would say around the 12th century, 11th and 12th, and probably others too, in smaller ways. And I'm just thinking from my part of the world. So the church has been there before. The church has come to a crossroads and gone, wow, significant enough changes have happened now in this moment to make me think we have to rediscover how to preach the gospel, make disciples, build churches, and reach the nations. And so I don't panic. That would be the first thing to say. But I think we are feeling our way a bit, and we've both, you and I, written a bunch of things about how we might do that. In the book, I try and zero in on issues of grace, freedom, and truth, which I think are three helpful ways of thinking how the 18th century church responded to their moment and how we can. I talk about that at some length there, so I probably won't rehash all of that. But I think there's a bunch of other smaller things the church needs to do. One of the things you and I've chatted about the need to do the way we do discipleship and formation in I love the word counter catechesis rather, because we have to sort of go what is being taught and how does the church. You have heard it was said in your generation, right. But I say to you, this is a really helpful way of thinking, and that's true in the way we teach and preach, and it's true in the way we make disciples. I think something that helps me a lot is Jesus's words when he first speaks in John's Gospel, and he says to the disciples following him, it's like, what do you seek? What do you want? What are you after? And it's a big theme in John, the idea of what is it that you are seeking? What's the thing in your heart that you want? And I think helping think through the things that contemporary people seek or are desiring or are looking for often are very good things, and things that in many ways they've got a slightly Christianized way of trying to find them, but they just haven't got Jesus in there, and just trying to work out you actually won't find that desire satisfied without Christ, and here's some of the ways in which you'll find a better fulfillment of that in him than you would in what you're looking for. And that's a very good evangelistic question. And so I think there's implications for our discipleship and for our evangelism, and many of them we sort of explore in lots of different ways. In books, even friends of ours have written. Chris Watkins' book, Biblical Critical Theory, and Rebecca's work, Rebecca McLaughlin, The Secular Creed, and things like that, which I think lots of people are going, here's some really good ways of trying to do that. So there's a lot of smart people on the case who are helping me, and God willing, we are helping others as well think this through. But I do think we've got to acknowledge this is quite a significant change. The only other thing I'd add is that it's a change that is coming much more quickly on your side of the Atlantic than on mine, in that a process that has taken 80 years in Britain and France and Germany and so on is taking about 8 years in America, in North America, and that is causing it to be, it's more unsettling in some ways for many people in your community than probably in mine. And so I probably feel a bit more breezy about it in some ways, because I think I've seen this happen slower. But it is obviously happening at quite a rate where you are, and it is a challenge, and it requires the best minds we have to think this stuff through, and all of us to engage with it creatively.
Yeah, you're really talking here, Andrew, about a lot of the stuff of what we're trying to do together at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, what we're trying to do with the other fellows and the ideas we're trying to think through in there. Ryan Burge has a graph about the relationship between industrialization, GDP growth, and religiosity, and the clear thesis is that they go hand in hand. The richer the country, the less religious it is, except for one country, which remains a significant outlier, in the United States. And in a lot of ways, the United States was a bigger outlier before the last 8 years, as you're talking about right there. But what we're seeing with the book that Burge contributed to, The Great Dechurching, with our friends Mike Graham and Jim Davis, there's potentially a lot of room to fall for the United States still to catch up to Great Britain, France, Switzerland, different places like that. So that's part of the urgency behind the work that we're trying to do. And yet when we look back, it's interesting that I don't find many Christians today lamenting the fall of the Roman Empire. Like sitting around saying, my goodness, if only we still had the Roman Empire, we'd be in great shape. And yet, what was that like in the day for Christians when that did happen? But what did it produce? Well, now at least we don't lament the fall of the Roman Empire, but we do celebrate the work of Augustine, which was produced in that milieu. You mentioned this earlier, but it's interesting that this very period that you're talking about was kind of a secular lull in some ways, but certainly in the United States, it was between the two biggest periods of evangelical religiosity in American history. And so these developments that you're talking about produced Jonathan Edwards, first in his responses in the First Great Awakening, and Wesley and Whitefield. And then it produced in the 18th century, the very aftermath of this 19th century, the largest expansion of religiosity in American history. So I just find the thing that's so fascinating to me about history, I guess it's similar, Andrew, to why I love sports. You don't know where it's going to go. That's what history teaches you, that only God knows in his providence what the next step is going to be. It's always surprising you. If somebody knew from history what was going to happen tomorrow, they'd be very rich and powerful people, but they don't. So that's what makes it interesting. Just like if somebody always knew what was going to happen in sports, then they'd be very rich and powerful, but they don't. That's what makes it really interesting here. We're talking with Andrew Wilson here about his book, Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West, published by Crossway. I just got a kick out of this, Andrew, imagining Voltaire being described as a Protestant pagan. I have a feeling he would not really appreciate that.
Oh, no.
What is a Protestant pagan?
So my argument in the book is that, or one of them, is that the shape of post-Christendom today is a product of two forces working together, one of which has always been present in human societies, which is paganism, understood in a sort of fairly, not in a pejorative way. By pagan, I don't mean, stupid people or whatever who worship the sun and the moon. I mean people who believe that the transcendent is located, which all humans feel a sense of the transcendent, right. But it's a question of where we locate it. Do we locate it in this world, right, like paganism does, or do you beyond the world, which is what monotheism does? And that paganism, in that sense, is part of the explanation for what's happening in the West today. That's clearly, it's not atheism, most of what we experience in the West today. I think about 15 years ago we thought it might be, but it doesn't look. That's not the main thing that's going on here. It's mostly a sort of spirituality is located within this world and self-improvement. But mingled with that, you have Protestantism, which is responsible for a lot of what the divisions in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, which lead, and it's a combination of Protestantism and the divisions that it kind of triggers or kind of confirms and amplifies, and the doubts that it weaponizes. And I'm as Protestant as anybody, right? So this is not like I don't like Protestant theology. This is just historically something that happens to Christendom, and it's the fusion of Protestantism and paganism together that creates the kind of post-Christian landscape we're in. Yeah. So when I call Voltaire or anyone else a Protestant pagan, what I mean is they are someone for whom spirituality is located, or the transcendent is located within this world. And Voltaire believed in God and was quite animated that people should. But spirituality, meaning transcendent, the other, and the sense of height and worship, effectively, is located within the world. But at the same time, a very Protestant, iconoclastic, tearing down the statues in the old. We've got a new kind of world here, and we need to doubt the religious traditions that our fathers have handed down to us and run it all through the filter of, for a Protestant, Scripture, and for an enlightener, reason. And Voltaire, in that sense, is a very Protestant pagan figure, and so a lot of people around us. And so when I go into my coffee shop and I see simultaneously invitations to a spiritual class of something, or yogic exploring of this, whatever, mingled with, in this house we believe that, and a creedal statement, Black Lives Matter, love is love, kindness is everything. Right. I think, wow, that's a very Protestant statement alongside a very pagan version of worship. And I think that's, to me, a pretty good two-word summary of the kind of spiritual landscape of the West today.
Yeah, you talk in the book about this worldly sense of ultimacy, happiness, and meaning, reformist zeal, moral certainty, commitment to progress, a generally Christian moral framework, all those things are part of that Protestant pagan sense as well. Now, the Great Divergence, you've alluded to it before, but not by name, has to be one of the most important transformations that I don't think we can talk enough about. And I love this section that you wrote, another little bit of a longer quote here. Quote, "If you put control-oriented, analytic people in an individualistic urban environment, give them a sense that the world will one day be better than it is now, and suffuse them with a deep conviction that there is an intelligence behind all things, whose secrets are just waiting to be unveiled, then you would expect such a society to value novelty and discovery, even if most of them remain religiously devout farmers. Give them a few centuries, and you might even expect them to produce Ben Franklin." End quote. Give us a little bit of the context here, Andrew, how you reached this conclusion amid endless academic debates over the nature of this economic explosion that began in the latter half of the 18th century.
Yeah. So summarize why the West suddenly got richer in the 18th century.
Or why you settled on this explanation amid every other one that was out there that you looked at.
I basically think there are four main types of explanation. I read a bunch about it, and there'll be people who know far more than me, but I think there are explanations of the great enrichment, is generally the language I use, but you're right, the great divergence, which are based on institutions. There's people who say this is because of, free trade and governments having the right amount of laws, but not too much, and institutional explanations of the kind of things that people, the way that the economy works internally and how governments function. There's explanations based on basically Western greed, colonialism, slavery, resource extraction, killing everybody, stealing all their stuff, that kind of explanation. There's explanations which are then based on culture, which is what you're describing, the sort of sense that Western people over time, but partly through the influence of Christianity, I think that's a big reason, become sort of interested in novelty and discovery and new ideas and start doubting and eventually rejecting things that they've left behind. And then there's explanations based on geography, which in a way I think are the most foundational causes. And I think all four of those are important to factor in. I think that geography is a big part of it, but I think the reason why the quote you read out, I find a really compelling part of the story, is because if you just one way I do this is to say, just look at all of the things that are invented, would be a good little way into this. And you look at, so in just the period I'm talking about, just the 2 or 3 years either side of 1776, and you look at the submarine, the S-trap toilets, the micrometer, the steam engine, and then eventually on into railways and all of these other, and you just think these are huge, the vaccine. And you're just massively important, influential, many of which we still use today. You've probably been vaccinated. You've probably got an S-trap toilet within a few yards of you right now. And you think, so why is it that almost all of those things were not just invented in northwestern Europe? They're actually almost all invented by English-speaking people in either England, Wales, Scotland, or North America. So what's going on? And I try and dig into that and say that actually the thread behind that, in part, is Protestantism, which produces all sorts of things like a desire for, some of the sort of more nebulous things like a belief the world's going to be better tomorrow than it is today, belief in providence of a creator God, ordered laws, scientific understanding and research, but also, produces literacy. And people were saying God's revealed himself in a book, so we better read. And you put a lot of those factors together and mix them in with, it's Francis Bacon, there's some other key thinkers there as well. You end up with a very Protestant heavy emphasis on discovery. Now that's just one slice of it, but I think it's a good example of the connection between Protestantism, discovery, novelty, curiosity, and the economic miracle that we now all live in the good of as we're having this conversation right now.
And take for granted. And completely take for granted. And
so it's a big complicated story, but I think this is a very much a big part of it. I think alongside it, there are some very contingent material things about where the water and the wood and the coal and the minerals and all that stuff are, which we really need to talk, and I talk about a lot as well. But I think there's the fusion of those two, the ideas and the material realities which create what we have today.
You close the book, Andrew, with 18th century Christian responses to 1776. which of them do you love the most?
I love them all, obviously, and talk about grace, freedom, and truth, talk about abolitionism, religious liberty, the emphasis on the personal experience of grace, particularly in hymns and personal testimonies. I think the two individuals who I feel the most affection for are Olaode Equiano and Johann Georg Hamann. Equiano is just astonishing. He's an enslaved person who gets liberated, gets converted, and then becomes an abolitionist, and just an extraordinary man, really. His testimony of God's grace in his life. I think the person who I found the most intellectually stimulating, though, to meet was Hamann, who is this genius of a philosopher who gets almost everybody who has ever written anything influential in philosophy at the time, Kant, Hegel, eventually Kierkegaard, Goethe, all saying, this guy is a genius. You must read what he's saying. He's brilliant. And he's just a prankster. He's got an incredible sense of humor. And he's this sort of German philosopher who is a brilliant Christian thinker who basically outflanks the Enlightenment on its own terms. And I think he, and the way he conceptualizes Christian truth and what it has to say to the Enlightenment, is probably my favorite Christian response. I also think he's the hardest to understand, and most people don't read. He writes in German. A lot of his stuff hasn't been translated yet. So he's not an easy person to just jump in and go, right, where shall I start in my devotions? He's not that guy. But such a compelling, funny, whimsical, and brilliant thinker. So he's probably the person that I kind of feel like if someone read my book and then went, what's the 18th century source I'd now most like to read next? I hope it would either be Olaode Equiano's interesting narrative or some of Harmon's work. I just think they're amazing.
We've got two questions here with Andrew Wilson talking about his book, Remaking the World, how 1776 created the post-Christian West, published by Crossway. All right, very, very important question here, Andrew. I visited Oliver Cromwell's house in Ely during my summer's visit to England, and I'll ask you the same question the museum asks everyone at the end. Hero or villain?
Depends if you're Irish. I think it would be a villain to many.
It's quite true.
I think that it is. There's a lovely quote. I don't remember who said it, but I heard it through the Rest is History podcast where they said, you can tell everything you need to know about a man's politics by which side he would have fought on at the Battle of Marston Moor. As in, would you, Cavaliers and Roundheads. And actually, I think it's a great question. So I have got quite Cromwellian instincts on a whole bunch of things. I'm probably more sectarian. I'm probably more of a Roundhead than a Cavalier. Although as a kid, I always wanted to be a Cavalier. They sounded cooler. But I think in the end, I'm not. But I think it still maps through to debates in Britain today about Brexit. Leave and remain. And there's even maps you can see about where people were pro Cromwell and where they were pro the king, and mapping that onto today, who votes to leave and who votes to remain in the Brexit referendum. So it's a debate in many ways that's still being played out. I would always lean more on the Cromwellian side. Okay. But I think certainly if you had any Irish brothers or sisters listening, they would definitely say villain, I'm sure.
I think as a Protestant, non-Catholic, non-Irish American, I got to the end and I dropped my coin or whatever in the hero side of things. And hard not to do that when you're thinking about, the connection to the Puritans and America's founding, things like that. But I was there with a man from Canada, a student there, a PhD student at Cambridge. He was just appalled. I was like, how could you possibly think that? How could you do that? I was like, well, I think we also have the differences between Canada and the United States in play here as well.
Totally.
Well, I might give you one last question here, Andrew. Tell us about your new podcast. Tell us about your new podcast with the Gospel Coalition, the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, Post-Christianity? ? Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So Glenn Scrivener and I had both written, I think, really quite different kinds of book, written at different levels with different focuses, but both really trying to do the same thing. So his book, The Air We Breathe, and my book, Remaking the World, both attempts, I think, to say to the church, here's a story of how you got here, and here's how you can learn from that to understand the world around you and to serve it better with the gospel. And so we thought the idea of doing a podcast together and exploring post-Christianity as a topic, so both telling the story about how we got here and then how the church can respond, would be a really fun idea. but particularly because Glenn and I are pretty much neighbours. He lives 100 yards away from me. We could just go down the road and record in a studio and have a live conversation, which was really, really fun. And then we got in some guests who are just brilliant. And so we got Kyle Harper, he's not a believer, but he's a very interesting historian of the ancient world, particularly, and some fascinating books recently on disease, and then particularly we looked at his book on sex and the transformation of that through Christianity. And we've got Carl Trueman, whose book The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self would be familiar to some listeners, and he came and joined us on the podcast. And then Rebecca McLaughlin, who I mentioned earlier. And Carl and particularly Rebecca talked a lot about the more practical, like how do we reach people in post-Christianity. And so we have 8 episodes. And I just found them, I mean, of course I would say this, but they were just really stimulating. Glenn is just so clever and hides his learning so well. So he just says such insightful things, but as if he's just thought of them without sounding like a nerd. It's really compelling. And so the two of us just sort of chatting away about all the different dynamics. But Glenn is also an evangelist. I'm a pastor, he's an evangelist. We both have to do the other thing as well, of course. But it was really interesting because we both spent a lot of time preaching and acting this out in local church live. So I hope it's also got some pastorally, evangelistically helpful application, as well as, I trust, some interesting history and cultural reflection. So, and our guests are brilliant. So yeah, I'm really excited about coming out. I think it's coming out somewhere you might know, actually, mid-October, I think.
Yeah, either we're recording this in mid-September, but it'll either be out or it'll be out enough where you can go find it on Apple Podcasts and go ahead and subscribe. I'm just going to say this is not very complicated. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast app, and you like this conversation, or you listen to anything that I do in Gospel Bound, I guarantee you're going to love this podcast. It's not a complicated ask there. These themes that we're talking about here come up frequently, but a lot of the things that we're working on, that we're working through with different authors on Gospel Bound come through in there. And it's just a very high priority for the Gospel Coalition, for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, this sense in which, as they talk about the ambiguity of post-Christianity, that in some ways we remain these Protestant pagans, our culture of being very obviously and exclusively Christian in ways that very few people recognize as they reject the confession of the faith in favor of a more pagan, this worldly application. So you'll see them work through those tensions. I think you'll find it fascinating, just like Andrew is saying here. So go subscribe to Post-Christianity, ? From Glenn Scrivener and Andrew Wilson. Pick up the book, Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. And Andrew, I want to close with this quote. It's a good one from you. Comes from your conclusion. You write this: fidelity scores higher than novelty. Loss of influence is not a cause for panic. The doctrines, experiences, and practices that the church needs today are much the same as the ones she needed in the 18th century and the 10th and the 2nd. We are responsible for obedience, not outcomes. Faithfulness, not fruit. If we do not see the results we used to by praying, worshiping, reading Scripture, serving the poor, preaching the gospel, sharing the sacraments, and loving one another, we carry on with those things regardless and walk by faith, not by sight. Genuine revival, when it comes, is at God's initiative rather than ours. In the meantime, we wait, rejoicing always, praying without ceasing, giving thanks in all circumstances, and resolving not to be anxious about tomorrow, for we have no idea what tomorrow will bring. Andrew Wilson, thanks for joining me on Gospel Bound.
Thank you so much for having me, Collin. Really, really enjoyed this conversation.